Wasabi guys, coming back at y'all with another Commander Secrets video. This time we're going to be looking at one of my favorite cards, and I know it's practically a meme at this point, especially for those of you who are longtime viewers of this channel. You know this is my favorite card. I am of course talking about Possibility Storm. I put it in just about every single deck that can synergize with it in the least bit, and I think it's one of those cards that is very discouraging to some people because all they really see is this huge wall of text, and they see it's a red enchantment. They don't necessarily think it's going to work well in their deck. While it isn't a perfect fit for every deck, I think it is just one of the most amazing cards that this format has to offer, and it really is meant for this format. In a multiplayer setting, this card is incredibly entertaining. Most people are at least open to the idea of playing with this out on the board. It's not the most oppressive enchantment that the game has to offer. There are way more oppressive spells, but there are still a ton of people that have their opinions about this card. They don't necessarily like it. I can understand if you are really focused on your own strategy and you don't want to have it all messed up. This is going to hinder a lot of your plans. It's going to make it to where if you have a bunch of expensive spells in your hand, there's a lot of potential for disappointment with this card, but there's also the potential that you strike gold. Let's say you have a Soul Ring in your hand, it's late game, you don't need a Soul Ring anymore, it gets exiled with the Possibility Storm, and then you get a way better artifact. So let me just read off real quickly what the card does, because I think it's worth explaining, because it is a huge wall of text. Whenever a player casts a spell from his or her hand, that player exiles it and then exiles cards from the top of his or her library until he or she exiles a card that shares a card type with it. That player may cast that card without paying its mana cost, and then they put all cards exiled with Possibility Storm on the bottom of their library in a random order. So let's say you cast an instant, maybe something like a Swords to Plowshares, that gets exiled, and then you exile cards from the top of your library until you reveal an instant, because it has to be the same card type. Once you hit another instant, like Counterspell, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost, and then the cards that you exiled with it are put on the bottom of your library in a random order. So nothing remains exiled with this card. They do go back to your library, so that is a good thing to point out there. Some people think cards go into permanent exile, which they do not. But really why I love this card is because there's so many cool interactions. This isn't like a win con or anything like that, but it's a very good enabler. It's also an amazing punisher at the same time, because you have to think about the control decks at the table. They might have their Swords to Plowshares, and they might get something completely different than that. Maybe they get a counter spell, which is completely useless in a lot of situations, especially when they get it off of Possibility Storm. They don't really have anything to counterspell, and they just wasted a spell. It's a very good punisher. It's a very good way to deal with those decks that want to play instant speed cards. Instant speed removal, counterspells really hinders their strategies, makes it to where they have to play on the fly. So I'm going to go over some pretty cool interactions here. There are a ton, and the first one that is the most noteworthy is going to be Mishra, Artificer Prodigy. Mishra is pretty well known for being one of those weird commanders where you wouldn't think that he's any good in this format, but if you do build around him, you can make it to where no matter what happens, you're going to get the artifacts that you want to get, and your opponents are always going to have to get something different. So Possibility Storm is a very cool card in combination with Mishra, because you're going to get something off the top of your deck with Possibility Storm, and you're going to get the card you originally wanted with Mishra that you were originally going to cast, your artifacts of course. So I think that is a pretty cool interaction there, but it's not my favorite. I know it's the main combo piece, one of the main combo pieces for a good solid Mishra deck, but there are other pretty awesome ones. We have Rurik Far the Unbowed. This is the guy that deals 6 damage to a player for casting a non-creature spell. This does include you, so you have to be careful. The cool thing about Possibility Storm is that it gives 2 castings, so the original card you still cast it even though it's exiled. So if your opponent wants to play a non-creature spell like an instant, then that has to go into Possibility Storm, exiles it, and you get another one. They're technically going to end up casting 2 non-creature spells, and it's going to be non-creature because they have to get an instant. So that's going to be a total of 12 damage off of Rurik Thar to them. And there's a ton of ways that you can win with a Rurik Thar, but to be honest, this one is very interesting, and this is one of the cards that I would throw into a Rurik Thar deck if I were to build one myself. Amazing. In a very similar way, we also have Cara Vac the Merciless. This works for your opponent's casting spells. Doesn't have to be non-creature. They're going to be casting 2 total spells. Again, doesn't matter if the first one gets exiled. Both are going to count, and you're going to get 2 different triggers with Cara Vac. So that should be a lot of damage you can deal to a creature or a player. Either way, that is fantastic. One of those cards that you must have in the deck. Just really enables what you want to do with this guy. Now, another cool commander option is Jorah the Guiteau. The cool thing about Suspend is that once you do run out of those time counters and you cast it, it's not casting from your hand. So it does get around Possibility Storm. It's worth noting that Possibility Storm specifically says whenever a player casts a spell from his or her hand. So if you have ways of getting around that, you should be good, while your opponents aren't always going to have those ways of getting around it themselves, which is why it's also good to play something like a Future Sight, where you could just play cards off the top of your library and it doesn't count towards Possibility Storm. Sometimes you do want the Possibility Storm trigger, sometimes you don't. If you're using this as a way to punish your opponents, then you probably want a way to get around it. Another way that is kind of cool to get around it, but isn't always super relevant, is Scroll Rack. All you really have to do is just organize your hand to where the next card that you're going to cast is going to be the same card type as the card that you put on the very top of your library. You can of course manipulate the top of your library with other cards, such as Sensei's Divining Top and Sylvan Library. Those 2 cards work out pretty well, kind of giving you a good setup there for the Possibility Storm trigger. So if you want a way to dodge the trigger, you want a way to get around it, that's not terrible either. Now, as far as the closest thing that I would consider a win con would probably be Storm, and you could throw this into decks such as Yidris Maelstrom Wielder, Cast Dissident Mage, and I think those are 2 pretty decent inclusions, because I feel like people overlook this card for Storm decks. Whenever you want to Storm off, yeah, you're not going to get the exact spell that you want every time you cast one, but you're going to be getting almost twice as many cast triggers as you normally would without it. So if you want to Storm off with the typical cards like Aetherflux Reservoir, Mind's Desire, maybe Tendrils of Agony, this is going to enable you even further build up your storm count to the point where you want to cast those spells, you get way more value out of them. And I think it works out pretty well in combination with Cascade. Yeah, you don't get twice as many Possibility Storm triggers with a Cascade trigger, but there's a whole bunch of cast triggers that you get off a Cascade in combination with Possibility Storm nevertheless. That's why I mentioned Maelstrom Wielder. Yet another cool combination when we're talking about Storm, or we're talking about anything that deals with cast triggers. We have to mention Paradox Engine. This card is just incredibly busted. Some people were surprised it didn't get banned in January, which I can understand. It's very powerful. It's an artifact. It can go into so many different decks. But you are getting, yet again, 2 different cast triggers, so you can stack any sort of tap abilities. Let's say you have an Azami Lady of Scrolls. All she wants to do is just give you more card draw by tapping your wizards. Well, the first spell you're going to cast is going to untap her, then you tap her in response right before you get to your second Possibility Storm cast trigger. Then you get to untap her all over again, and this goes for your artifacts. You can float a ton of mana this way. Really brilliant combination of cards there as well. Now we go on to the last part of this, and it really just has to do with locking down your opponents and just chaos in general. And we have to mention cards like Curse of Exhaustion and Teferi, Mage of Zhalfir. Curse of Exhaustion is basically just a way to lock down one of our opponents. They can do very little to get around this. They have to flash back cards. They have to, get around stuff that they normally would, using cards like Future Sight to get around the Possibility Storm. But most of the time this isn't going to be the case, and they're going to have to cast spells from their hand, which is going to leave them with no spells at all. It is a pretty mean, disgusting lock, and there are a ton of cards that do something like Curse of Exhaustion, but most of them are going to impact you as well, which is why I'm not going to mention them. But we also have Teferi, Mage of Zhalfir, which is yet another good lock. This is actually going to lock down all of your opponents because they have to cast spells anytime they would normally cast a sorcery, which Possibility Storm allows you to cast spells off of a trigger, and technically that does go onto the stack, so they cannot cast the spell that they get off of it. The original spell they wanted to cast is exiled, so they end up with 0 cards. He works amazingly well with another card called Knowledge Pool, which kind of does the same thing when it comes to casting spells off of a trigger instead of just casting them as a normal sorcery at sorcery speed. So Teferi is just brutal with this card. It's just insane. And the last card I would say works out pretty well with Possibility Storm. Doesn't even have anything to do with the actual card or just interacting with it. Is probably Norn the Wary, but you could probably just use any sort of chaos deck. I just like Norn the Wary because I think he's chaotic enough. The deck is based around triggers, doing stuff in response to what your opponents are doing. Norn does that pretty well himself, and the entire deck is just based around disruption and making things a lot harder for your opponent. So if you want to go the chaotic route, that's my suggestion as a perfect commander for this card. But you really can't go wrong. There are a ton of options with Possibility Storm. It has Storm in the name, so yet again I advise you, if you're a Storm player in Commander, this is a great card. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. I really hope that if you don't know by now, Possibility Storm is a fantastic card in Commander. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this series. As always, you all have a wonderful day. Void here signing off. See you all next video.